The cabin door creaked open, letting in the icy morning air that nipped at Will Mckenna's cheeks. He tightened his father's old flannel jacket around him, though it did little to keep the cold out. It was a relic, patched up here and there, passed down through the family for decades, just like the rifle slung over his shoulder. An old 30-30 Winchester, its wooden stock worn smooth by generations of hands. This rifle had seen more hunts than Will could imagine, and today it was his turn to carry it. Will's father, Frank, followed him out of the cabin, his steps slow and measured as they moved into the woods. "Today's the day, son," Frank said quietly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Same gun your granddaddy used to get his first buck, and the one I used for mine. Now it's yours." Will nodded, the weight of the 30-30 heavier on his shoulders now. He'd always known about the Mckenna tradition. Each boy, when he was old enough, took his first buck with this rifle. It had been his grandfather's pride, and his father's, and now Will felt both excitement and pressure swirling in his chest. He'd been dreaming of this day for years, but now that it was here, his hands shook a little, nerves running high. Frank looked over, noticing the way Will adjusted the rifle on his back. He smiled slightly, a rare warmth in his eyes. "She's a good gun, Will. Trust her. She's never missed when it counted." They set off into the woods, the only sounds their boots crunching on the frozen leaves, and the occasional gust of wind rustling the branches. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, but the first pale light of dawn was creeping in. Will's heart raced in his chest, each step taking him deeper into the woods, closer to his first hunt. The 30-30 felt solid in his hands, the wood smooth and cool. His grandfather had told him stories about this rifle, about the cold mornings like this one when he had crouched in the same woods, waiting for his first buck. Will's father had done the same when he was 12. Now it was Will's turn, and the weight of those stories felt as real as the gun in his hands. Frank led the way through the trees, moving silently like he always did. Will tried to mimic his father's steps, but every now and then a twig snapped underfoot, or his breath came too loud in the cold air. He felt clumsy next to his father, but Frank never said a word. They stopped in a small clearing, the ground covered in a thin layer of frost. Frank crouched down behind a fallen log, motioning for Will to do the same. Will obeyed, settling into the stillness of the woods. His heart hammered in his chest, the excitement almost unbearable now. For a long time, nothing moved. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the whole world was waiting for something to happen. Will's fingers gripped the 30-30 tightly, the weight of the rifle somehow grounding him, connecting him to his father and his grandfather, and to the generations of Mckennas before him who had walked these same woods. Suddenly, Frank tensed beside him, his eyes narrowed, and he held up a hand. Will froze, his breath catching in his throat. He followed his father's gaze through the trees, but he couldn't see anything yet. His pulse quickened, his fingers slick on the stock of the rifle. A sound, a faint rustling in the underbrush. Will's heart leapt into his throat. Frank's hand tightened on his shoulder. "There," he whispered, barely audible. "It's a buck." Will swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He squinted through the trees and then, there it was, a flash of brown just beyond the clearing moving silently through the woods. Will's breath caught. The buck stepped into the open, its head low, sniffing the air. A spikehorn. His father's words from years of lessons echoed in his mind. "Don't rush, take your time, breathe." Will raised the 30-30 slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. His hands shook slightly, but the weight of the rifle felt comforting now, steady in his grip. This rifle had never missed a first shot for the Mckenna men. His grandfather had dropped his first buck with it. His father too. Now it was Will's turn. The buck took a step closer, oblivious to the two figures hidden in the shadows. It was almost too perfect. Will's pulse raced, every beat thudding in his ears. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't pull it. Not yet. Frank's voice was barely a whisper. "You've got him, Will. Just breathe." Will exhaled slowly, the frosty air clouding in front of him. The buck lifted its head, its ears twitching, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. The world was silent, just Will, the buck, and the rifle. His finger tightened on the trigger. The crack of the 30-30 split the stillness of the morning, echoing through the trees. The buck jolted, stumbled, and then darted into the brush. For a heartbeat, Will didn't move. His whole body was shaking now, the adrenaline surging through him. He'd taken the shot, but had it hit? The moment stretched, the silence almost deafening. Frank clapped him on the back, a broad grin spreading across his face. "Good shot, son. Real good. We'll give him a minute." Will nodded, his heart still hammering in his chest. He felt lightheaded but elated at the same time. He had done it. He'd taken the shot. They waited in the clearing, the forest slowly returning to life around them. Will couldn't stop thinking about the rifle, the same one his father had used in this exact moment and his grandfather before him. Now he was part of that legacy. After a few minutes, Frank stood. "Let's go find him." They moved slowly through the trees, following the trail left by the buck. Will's eyes darted to the ground, looking for any sign, and then he saw it, blood on the frosted leaves. His heart skipped a beat. Frank crouched down, inspecting the trail. He smiled. "You got him, Will. He's hit." Will's chest swelled with pride. They followed the blood trail, moving carefully, each step taking them closer. The 30-30 felt lighter in his hands now, the tension easing as they walked. Then, up ahead, the buck lay still in a small clearing. Will stopped, staring at it. The spike horn, his first buck, just like his father and grandfather before him. Frank placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice quiet but filled with pride. "You did good, son. Just like your granddaddy, just like me." Will couldn't stop smiling. The old rifle had done its job again, just like it always had. This was more than just a hunt. It was a tradition, one that he was now part of, and he'd carry that legacy forward. The Mckenna rifle hadn't missed.